I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me here on KJLH. We are back for another in-depth discussion of the issues that matter. I'm glad to be here with you at the start of what I know will be a productive and peaceful week. And I want to let you know, as always, you can find me online at Radio Free KJLH on Instagram. You can also find me on my personal page on Instagram, Dara Tucker B. I'm on all other platforms as Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Well, I had several folks to reach out to me after last week's show. I always appreciate it when you all let me know that the topics that I bring to you are causing you to think and to reflect and maybe consider things from a point of view that you hadn't before. It's always good to know that we're not alone in how we see the world. And it's important to have our worldview challenged as well. So whatever effect the conversation has had on you, I want to hear about it. KJLH will post the show on their Instagram page and you can leave your thoughts there. We would love to hear from you. You can also download the KJLH app on your phone and take the breakdown with you wherever you are. And it's also available as a podcast. You can visit kjlhradio.com to listen to any episodes that you might have missed. Wherever you find it, I hope you find it to be stimulating and thought-provoking. Now, today we're going to talk about a phenomenon that's not really a new one, but there are always new ways in which the old concepts and strategies are sold to us. New terminologies are in circulation right now, but really, as we all know, there's nothing new under the sun. But one of those old terms that's getting a facelift for the information age is a term known as race hustling. Now, if you've been around for a while, you know that race hustling is not really new. The terminology may be, but we've heard accusations about race baiting, race profiteering, and that kind of thing for a long time. And as a lot of you may know by now, I do a lot of educating online around various topics. And I had the chance to address this topic of so-called race hustling recently in one of my breakdowns. I got into some of the modern day discussions around this topic, particularly as that accusation tends to be leveled by right-wing TV hosts. But I also discussed a bit of the history around this term and its associated terms and how and why those accusations come about. And if you follow me online or if you've been listening to this show for the last few weeks, you may have started to figure out that I like to provide historical context for the issues that I bring to you. I'm not really into the hot takes. I like to be well-studied, well-researched, and well-grounded in the particular historical framework in which these issues exist. So what are we to make of this supposed phenomenon of race hustling in the modern era? Hopefully, we're all going to be a little bit more adept at parsing through some of this rhetoric about how we discuss race in 2024. So take a listen to this breakdown on race hustling, and I'm going to come back. We're going to talk about it. All right, here it is. What exactly is a race hustler? This is a term you hear thrown around more and more these days. The term race hustler is a relatively new toy obtained by conservatives right around the time they colonized the terms critical race theory and woke, though the term's origins might actually surprise you. But if we pan out just a bit, you'll find this really is just a rebranding of an old accusation that's often leveled against anyone upsetting the status quo by speaking out against racial intolerance. The term race hustler is a pretty broad accusation that tends to refer to any person who is suspected of enriching themselves by stirring up trouble between the races. Now, this can apply to a black or a white person or anyone in between, but unsurprisingly, this is yet another term that was invented by black folks and gentrified by white folks. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois famously disagreed about the way in which black folks should comport themselves in the U.S. following slavery and Jim Crow. Booker T. Washington famously said of Du Bois and his ilk, "There is a class of colored people who makes a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs." He went on to say, "There is a certain class of race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well, because as long as the disease holds out, they have not only an easy means of making a living, but also an easy medium through which to make themselves prominent before the public." The problem with this statement, as I see it, is when has there ever been a point in U.S. history where the patient was properly treated in the first place? Has America's original sin ever been fully atoned for, or even partially? Has America ever made strides to course correct after 70 years of exclusionist Jim Crow policies that created generations of wealth inequality? Is America really ready to grapple with the clear through line between decades of redlining, federal housing discrimination, and wage inequality, and how those policies have impacted the ability of Black folks to create and maintain wealth in the present day? The idea that any of those larger issues were being addressed when Booker T. Washington wrote those words in 1911 is laughable, because America is still pretending that those policies should have no impact now. To reflexively accuse someone of profiteering from racial animus when you have never fully examined or grappled with the root causes of that animus would be like accusing a person who's walking with a limp of doing so because they enjoy the attention it brings them, knowing full well that their leg has never been set properly after being broken. And if you're a white American making this accusation, you might do well to consider who broke that leg in the first place. It's a lot easier to accuse those who are speaking up about racial disparities of grifting for profit than it is to acknowledge and atone for the sins of your forefathers. Now, there are, of course, folks within every movement who are driven by the profit motive. But if your objective is to discredit a movement, it would be in your best interest to place a disproportionate focus on those people in order to delegitimize the movement altogether. The fact is, a person who is truly interested in justice doesn't go around wielding terms like race baiter or race hustler indiscriminately. If it is necessary to address those behaviors at all, a conscientious person would do so with a scalpel, not with a hatchet. When you hear terms like race hustler being thrown around anytime race is brought up, try asking yourself who might be benefiting from making that accusation in the first place. So modern day race hustling, is this really a thing? And if so, do we need to be on the lookout for it? Well, I'll admit in the past, I've leveled this accusation against a few folks in my private conversations. And to be honest, there are still a few folks that I would probably categorize this way. The question for me though is, does it matter? Does it matter? Are the majority of the folks providing leadership in the Black community, doing activism work, heading up major organizations, providing commentary, are there a significant number of so-called race hustlers out there who are simply interested in profiteering off of the issue of race, who ultimately don't really want to see things get better because it benefits them if they don't? Well, they exist for sure, but I think there's a big difference between someone who really could not care less about the issues that affect the Black community, who's simply taking a paycheck by supposedly stirring up controversy, and someone who earns a legitimate living from writing books or doing public speaking, or someone who's a bona fide anti-racism practitioner. I think there's a big difference between crass commercial profiteering and providing information, education, or leadership in a field where you happen to make your living. Even the Bible says a workman is worthy of his hire. So if you're doing work that is valid and necessary and honest, there's no reason why you should feel ashamed because you pay your bills with it. A pastor, a doctor, or a counselor all make paychecks from doing work that is crucial. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think anyone who refuses to make that distinction and simply lumps anyone who regularly discusses race and racism into the bucket of a so-called race baiter is really just attempting to deflect from the issues that are being discussed. That's a diversionary tactic that ought to be met with suspicion. But I want to get back to the idea that this concept, this term race hustling, first emanated from the Black community, and it did. One of the earliest accusations that we can find of so-called race profiteering is the discourse between Booker T. Washington, who was really known as an accommodationist, and it was leveled against W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an academic, a sociologist, and the first Black man to obtain a PhD from Harvard. Du Bois became an early civil rights activist and writer, and he was a co-founder of the NAACP, so he was one of the most important figures in the movement for Black liberation, as was Booker T. Washington, but they had very different approaches. Now, it's important to understand how this conversation has evolved. The accusations that Booker T. Washington made against people like Du Bois came from, I would say, a genuine place. This was public discourse being had between two Black men who were essentially fighting for the same thing. They were very different people who came from very different circumstances, which helped to explain why they approached things so differently, but they had the same end goal in mind. They wanted to see Black folks advance and become functioning members of society in the wake of slavery and in the midst of crippling Jim Crow laws that were in full effect for most of their lives. Now, most of us have heard the names Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but we may not know a lot about them, or it may have been a while since we studied about them. But understanding who these two men were and why they were having this conversation around race profiteering in the first place is really instructive and can help us to understand why many of the folks who are leveling this accusation today are engaged in deflecting and gaslighting and could not be less interested in true liberation for Black people. So I really want to take some time and provide historical context for you. We're going to talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington, who did bring the motives of people like W.E.B. Du Bois into question, he was born a slave. He thought right around 1856. He didn't know for sure, but it was certainly in the waning days of slavery. He spent the first 9 years or so of his life as a slave. His 1901 autobiography called Up From Slavery really laid out the narrative of his life and kind of helped to bridge the understanding between the antebellum period and the post-slavery period from a perspective of a formerly enslaved man. So it was something entirely different. No one had seen anything like this before. Booker T. Washington's father was a white man who presumably violated his mother, and he never knew him. He was also born in the South, in Virginia. So already, you know, he's coming from a very different perspective than someone like Du Bois, who was born free in 1868 in Massachusetts, in the North. Booker T. Washington was never actually given a proper last name. When slavery ended, he was finally able to go to school, and he had to give himself the last name Washington, which was his stepfather's first name, because he had never been given a surname, which was fairly common in that day. Booker T. Washington is very much invested in the plight of working class and poor Black people in the South, who have been left with very few options in the wake of slavery and Reconstruction. They're living under oppressive laws called Black codes that restricted their movement and access. So they're living in what's essentially an apartheid state. That's exactly what it was. So Booker T. Washington is very much concerned with the practical matters that affect the day-to-day lives of the formerly enslaved and their children. He knows that encouraging them to learn trades and learning how to comport themselves in a way that's going to keep them out of jail and keep them alive are the factors that will most readily affect their ability to live out their lives in peace. He really didn't believe in actively opposing Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal status quo. He believed that Black people should accept the law of the land and learn how to be self-sufficient in these externally imposed silos. So just accept things as they are, learn the trades, learn the value of common labor, since most Black folks were not allowed to be educated or were not given access to education at that time. So his strategy was to teach them self-improvement, to learn to be worthy members of society. So that sounds pretty awful now, but considering the time, Booker T. Washington and many other Black leaders at the time really felt like this was the best approach for teaching the common man self-sufficiency and improving his quality of life. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, was about 10 years younger than Washington, but he was light years ahead of him in his thinking and approach. Being born in 1868 in the North gave him a completely different perspective on things. In addition to being born a free man, he was an academic and an intellectual. He considered himself to be a part of the so-called talented 10th that he believed should be thought leaders within the Black community. He was an educated man who came from a family of landowners, and he had been raised around a lot of white folks who treated him fairly well. He didn't deal with the kind of oppressive discrimination that was Booker T. Washington's experience. So Du Bois graduated college, he attended Fisk University and HBCU in Nashville, and being in the South during his college years was the first time that Du Bois really encountered Jim Crow laws and was in proximity to lynchings and voter suppression and things like that, extreme bigotry. This was an eye-opening experience for him, and it was really the first time that he got to see how the common Black man was living in the U.S. This was the late 1880s and 1890s. So he went on his way to obtain his degrees from Harvard, 2 undergraduate degrees and eventually a PhD. So Booker T. Washington, right around this time, made a very famous speech called the Atlanta Address, which led to a set of policies called the Atlanta Compromise that basically laid out his philosophy of how Black folks should conduct themselves in the Jim Crow era. This was a speech that really embodied what we would think of now as respectability politics, although that was not a term that people would have been using at that time. But this speech really set him up to be a major spokesperson for Black people at that time. This was ironically the year that Frederick Douglass died. This was 1895. Now, Frederick Douglass, as you may know, had been the most prominent spokesperson for Black people up until that time. And he had met with Lincoln in the White House. He was a huge proponent of abolition. And Frederick Douglass helped to influence Lincoln's thinking on this issue. Well, Frederick Douglass passed away in 1895. So Black folks were getting to the point that they were looking for new leadership in this new post-slavery era. era that was upon them. Who are we going to be now? What are the goals that we're reaching for? Of course, now that they were free in the most technical senses, but not really. So as Booker T. Washington rose to prominence in this post-slavery era, he was there to advise not only Black people about how to rise above their circumstances, he felt, but he was also there to act as a go-between with them and the white community. So Booker T. Washington made some very important alliances with both Black and white leaders throughout his career. He helped to develop the Tuskegee Institute, which was a prominent historically Black university in Alabama that still exists now, that trained young Black educators who then went on to teach at schools throughout the South. Now, during his time developing and leading the Tuskegee Institute, he really emphasized industrial education. Remember, this is really at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. So he marketed the Tuskegee Institute as an industrial training college for Black folks. And he started to develop alliances with super wealthy white folks like Andrew Carnegie, who made a huge endowment to Tuskegee's library, and John D. Rockefeller, George Eastman, whose company later became Eastman Kodak, and a lot of other millionaires like that who he convinced to donate to Tuskegee. So he was doing a lot of good work. But this speech in 1895 that brought about the agreement known as the Atlanta Compromise was really unsettling to some folks in the younger generation like W.E.B. Du Bois, who felt like Black folks should be much more assertive in pushing for equal rights and equal access and equal treatment under the law. With the Atlanta Compromise, Booker T. Washington came to an agreement with a lot of Southern leaders that said that they could continue to impose these Jim Crow laws, and Black folk would essentially agree to continue to live under those laws in exchange for increased access to education, economic opportunities, and the loosening of some legal restrictions. And this was something that a lot of white folks in the South could get behind, but it really riled up a lot of the younger generation who thought these policies were much too conciliatory and docile. Now, by this point in the late 1890s, Du Bois has done some teaching in the North, and he's gone on to be a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, and he conducted a study called the Philadelphia Negro that really impacted how he saw the race problem in the U.S. Du Bois interviewed thousands of poor Black folk in Philadelphia, and he came to a few conclusions: that the segregated cities were extremely damaging to both the ability of Black folks to advance economically and to their morale, really their spirits. And the second conclusion that he came to was that Black people would always have to live with a sort of dual identity. He described this as a double consciousness. They were Americans, but they were always going to be Black in America, so they would always be regarded as the other. So I'm going to read to you a short excerpt from an essay that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that is pretty emblematic of the philosophy that he carried with him for the rest of his life. This concept of Pan-Africanism that says Black folks all over the world should essentially identify as displaced Africans who were really one people. This is an essay that Du Bois wrote called Strivings of the Negro People for a publication called The Atlantic Monthly in 1897. So he writes, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem? One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." So Du Bois goes on to be highly accomplished and widely regarded as one of the leading voices of the Black intelligentsia in the early part of the 20th century, the era of the so-called New Negroes, and even moving into the Harlem Renaissance. He's someone that people like Ralph Ellison and Langston Hughes look up to as a beacon and an important voice in how the new generation of Black folks should see themselves at the dawn of the new century. And by the early 20th century, Booker T. Washington's way of thinking is really starting to be seen as the old way by a lot of younger Black folks who believe in taking much more of a proactive stance and fighting for their own liberation. Now, Du Bois and Washington are both doing a lot of writing at this time, essays, articles, books, and this is really the way that discourse happens at this point in history. And they acknowledge that they're both fighting for the same thing, just with different methodologies because of their varying generational perspectives and backgrounds. So W.E.B. Du Bois was very much involved in expanding the civil rights movement to the Caribbean islands and really reaching out and helping Black people all over the world really understand that they were involved in a common struggle for freedom and for human rights. He wrote a wildly successful seminal book called The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, and he helped found the NAACP in 1909, and he edited their monthly publication called The Crisis, where he shared a lot of his philosophies on Pan-Africanism and the fight for equal rights. So this is when you hear Booker T. Washington really become critical of the position of W.E.B. Du Bois and others and their more assertive, sort of in-your-face approach to demanding to be regarded as equal citizens, both in the U.S. and abroad. So this is the backdrop against which a lot of these accusations that Booker T. Washington was making about some folks not wanting the Negro to lose his grievances because they didn't want to lose their jobs, that kind of thing. This is the context in which this discussion was taking place. He was basically saying that because Du Bois and others had really positioned themselves as the premier commentators on race and equality during the early part of the 20th century, that they had a lot to lose if this discussion around the so-called Negro problem went away. But I think Washington really resisted this idea that the black man should have to ask anything of the white man at all. He truly believed in self-sufficiency and just wanted black folks to be free to pursue their livelihood as best they could. Let's not forget that Lincoln himself was quoted as saying in one of his campaign debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858 that he didn't think that it was really possible for black and white people to live peaceably with each other. That was one of the reasons that people like Lincoln didn't ever really jump fully onto the abolition train. They didn't know what would happen when black folks gained their freedom. Would they be repatriated to the Caribbean or back to Africa? Would they be given their own land in the U.S.? Surely white folks wouldn't be expected to live side by side with the slave class. It was unthinkable for a lot of white people at that time. So what Booker T. Washington was doing in his mind and in the minds of a lot of white people was attempting to create a stopgap that allowed Americans to envision a world where black and white people had their place, separate but equal, and each was allowed to live in peace. Black folks would be allowed to be educated and earn a decent living, and white folks wouldn't have to feel threatened. So yes, Booker T. Washington felt that Du Bois and his ilk were asking too much, plain and simple. But what this conversation really between these two men shows is that the pathway towards black liberation was never a straight road. And black folks have never been monolithic in their thinking. There has always been room for disparate voices, and different messages have resonated with society at different times. But ultimately, they were pushing towards the same goal of liberation and equality for black folks. Now, some of these folks throwing around accusations of racial profiteering nowadays, not so much. When you hear this accusation, it's generally not coming from someone who has the least bit of interest or investment in the advancement of black folks in this country. As I said at the end of the breakdown I did on this, the real question that we should be asking ourselves is how much money is being made in the business of denying that structural racism exists at all? Because last I checked, most of these conservative commentators who beat that drum endlessly and decry the establishment of DEI programs and constantly warn about the Bigfoot of supposed reverse racism and throw all the suburbanites into a panic about critical race theory, Tucker Carlson, Elon Musk, Candace Owens, pretty much every Fox News host out there, they're all millionaires. That's the irony here. Supposedly, there's all this fame and money to be earned by discussing race and racism when the majority of folks that they're accusing of self-aggrandizing around the issue are not the ones making bank. The folks criticizing them are. As a matter of fact, if you're black and you're willing to get out there and make the majority of Americans feel good about the state of race relations in this country and tell them that things are not as bad as some folks make it seem, you will be well on your way to financial security in no time. Trust me, I have a mutual, Elizabeth Booker Houston, online who did an entire video dispelling this idea that there is all this money to be made from discussing racism. She basically said that a political action committee, a left-leaning organization, reached out to her to do some content, the type of content that she already does. And they reached out to her to have her do some progressive content for them. And she told them what her rate was, $3,000 per video or something like that. And they ghosted her. And she said, they don't have that kind of money. But you know who does? Conservatives. They have that kind of money. And she's like, do you know what the going rate for a well-educated, well-spoken black person is who's willing to launder their racism for them? That's where the money is. So I think when we're hearing these accusations around so-called race hustling, we need to first understand that this is a gentrified term that has historically been used within the black community to hold one another to account for exactly how we move towards the shared goal of equality and justice. It's fundamentally meant to be a conversation around philosophies and methodologies, not a questioning of the validity of the conversation around equality itself. When you hear the accusation of race hustling, first ask yourself, who is making that accusation? Do they spend the majority of their time denying that there is a problem around race at all? If they do, chances are they are making a lot of money doing that, or they are well on their way to making a lot of money doing that, and their motives should absolutely be questioned. Well, that's our time for today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of current events accompanied by a bit of a deep historical dive to contextualize things. It's my favorite kind of discussion to have, and I look forward to having many more of these kinds of discussions with you in the coming weeks and months. My name is Dara Star Tucker. Look for me on the KJLH Instagram page. Let's chop it up over there at Radio Free KJLH. And you can also find me on my Instagram page at Dara Tucker B and on all other platforms at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Don't forget to download the KJLH app and listen to us anytime. I look forward to meeting with you same time, same place next week, where we'll do another deep dive into the issues that matter. We'll meet again soon. And until then, let's learn to shout.